We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
The Department of Homeland Security paying non-governmental organizations to claim Republicans are terrorists. The debt negotiations in full swing, and Twitter comes into its own. All this and more on today's edition of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio American Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to take a moment to wish a fond hello to our listeners out in Chester Springs, Philadelphia on WFYL 1180 AM. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Negotiations between President Joe Biden and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy seem set to raise the national debt from $31.4 trillion to somewhere around the $35 trillion mark. Now, what does that mean for the nation? What does it mean in terms of the interest payments, most importantly? Well, to figure all this out, we're joined by Mr. Andrew Moran, economics correspondent and editor at LibertyNation.com. Andrew, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So, Andrew, let's discuss what the cuts were that were made in the proposed deal there. And so I believe it was $50 billion. Is that right?
Yeah, so it's about $50 billion in cuts. This includes about $30 billion that's gone from COVID-19 related spending, and then the other $20 billion over 2 years from the new IRS funding. And the rest are just spending caps for the next 2 years, and then they're gone after 2026. And then some of it's energy permitting reform, although that is bogus too if you dive deeper into the legislation. So overall, this bill pretty much it angers a lot of fiscal conservatives.
You know, I think the key thing that nobody except you on the pages of LibertyNation.com really point this out is that the amount of cuts that the Republicans who are in favor of this particular deal are celebrating will be eaten up in interest payments for the newly borrowed money anyway, won't it?
Exactly. So let's look at some of the numbers here. So if you look at Biden's 2024 budget proposal, he proposes spending $82 trillion over the next 10 years. If you look at the latest Congressional Budget Office report, it says that the Republican proposal to cap spending will reduce that spending by $1.5 trillion over that same time span. Now, when we talk about interest payments, again, the White House proposal says interest payments will be about $3.1 trillion over the next 10 years. You look at the CBO report again, it says that this Fiscal Responsibility Act will reduce interest payments by $188 billion. So you have astronomical numbers, and then the Republican leadership will go into it and say, this is a great deal for America. It's worthy of the American people. How can anyone say that with a straight face when you look at the long-term spending projections from the Republicans, from the White House, and the CBO?
Now, let's put this into really, really simple terms that even I can understand. Does this mean, and correct me if I'm wrong here, that the $50 billion that's being lauded as savings by some Republicans, that essentially is less than the new amount of interest that will be paid on the new money that's being borrowed?
Yeah, exactly. So if the latest CBO report, not the one that came out a couple of months ago, it says that total interest payments will be about $600 billion this year. So $50 billion with $600 billion interest payments, this is nothing. I wrote in my article recently that will not even cover 2 months worth of interest payments, this $50 billion in savings that the Republicans are touting for this year and next year. So overall, it's hard to fathom how that's going to do anything for interest payments, especially when you consider that interest alone is now one of the biggest budget items every single year in this rising rate environment. It's going to be about $1 trillion a year by at least 2030. So yeah, interest payments are keep going up, and there's no way that anything is going to be done to mitigate that because no one's willing to take a chainsaw, not, as I said in my article, eyebrow scissors to cut the budget.
So there's a couple of questions I need to follow up on regarding the interest here. Now, I see on television, on the rare occasions I watch, I always see these adverts for use our debt restructuring company to help you limit your repayments. Why isn't the U.S. government doing something similar, looking at a way to restructure their debt? Because to me, it seems as though you're reaching a point where all receipts that come in will be equal to the amount that has to go out in just debt payment, which doesn't cover all the things that are I guess they're called non-discretionary, which means the things that have to be paid year on year.
Yeah, the mandatory spending. I mean, that accounts for 2/3 of the budget, and nobody touches. But to your broader question about debt restructuring, the thing is that there is such a demand for U.S. government bonds that there's no need to restructure any debt. I mean, the U.S. isn't Greece for now. There's not going to be a sovereign debt crisis occurring. That these debt restructuring things that happen on a national scale, that only happens when you become a country like Greece, and that requires the IMF to intervene or the World Bank to intervene or all these massive international organizations.
Yeah, in Greece and Italy, where that happened, where the EU appointed a new country's leader, courtesy of the IMF.
Yeah, so no one's gonna oust Joe Biden or the next Republican nominee over.
I would suggest that if the IMF were going to oust America's leader and then put a puppet in control there, I'd suggest that they would just hire Joe Biden back again, wouldn't they? Or is that's maybe just my opinion on that? Now, the second question I had about this: so America's going to be borrowing this extra $4 trillion over the period of a couple of years. Now, who are they borrowing that from?
So what they go to the capital markets. They sell treasury bonds. They sell it to individual investors. They sell it to institutions. They sell it to foreign investors, foreign governments. You and I talked off air about foreign demand for treasury bonds. You look at the latest treasury numbers, and it shows that all these foreign governments are scooping up government bonds. However, at the same time, the demand has actually lowered over the past year. So China used to be the largest holder of U.S. government debt. It's become number 2 because its holdings of U.S. Treasury debt has fallen about 20% over the past year to around $860 billion.
Who's number 1 now?
Japan, but also Japan, though, over the past year, it's been on a downward trend of buying U.S. government debt, except from December to January. But overall, all foreign holdings of Treasury securities have been on a decline over the past year, from about 4.3 to $3.8 trillion.
So, Andrew, are you telling me that the American taxpayer is going to be on the hook for the next decade to paying back money to China?
Well, next decade, I mean, you look at the numbers, and it's going to be future generations covering all this debt because nobody's slowing down whatsoever. The government taxes, borrows, and inflates, and that is the mantra of Washington today, and perpetual can kicking.
Rinse, cycle, debt, repeat, as the title of your article told us today, Andrew. Andrew Moran, thanks ever so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio right here on the Radio America Network. Now, later in the show, we have special guest Brent Bozell of the Media Research Center here to talk about a special report conducted by the Media Research Center into the DHS targeting conservatives and Christians across America. Now, that's some heady stuff, so don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this short break talking liberty with Scott D. Cosenza discussing the latest Twitter debacles for the Democrats. Now, don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Entertaining, informative, and just plain fun. Watch Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5. Produced by conservatives for conservatives. C5's The Left Free Zone. Hosted by Liberty Nation's Lisa K. Donner. Joined by a raucous, irreverent panel of authors. Deconstructing leftist narratives. Debating the hot topics. And remembering to laugh. Join the official conservative safe space.
You only did that to piss Jeff off.
Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5.